Welcome to Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where the First World War meets popular culture. For this episode, Jessica, Chris and I went on a field trip to see Oh What a Lovely War, a 60th anniversary production by Black Eyed Theatre at the Leeds Playhouse. In 1962, to commemorate Armistice Day, the BBC aired music radio show The Long Long Trail, which featured popular songs from the First World War. Inspired by this, Jerry Raffles suggested to his partner, theatre director Joan Littlewood, the radio show could be used as a basis for production. Believing it to be pure nostalgia, Littlewood was not initially keen on the idea, but with music from The Long Long Trail, Littlewood and the cast developed the script. In the notes to the play published in the early 2000s, Littlewood recalls how each member of the cast had a personal story to add about the First World War and how they raided local libraries, dug out facts and figures. Littlewood refused to use military uniforms for the production and had all the actors wear Pierrot costumes, a sort of a stock French pantomime costume. Key to the narrative of the play were slides projected showing pictures of the war. As the war progressed, a running total of deaths was shown with the battles fought. The play was originally performed in 1963 at the Theatre Royal Stratford East in London. It received rave reviews, though not initially allowed to transfer to the West End as it was blocked by the official censor. The play was converted to the silver screen by Richard Attenborough in 1969. So where do we want to start? I had not seen the play before, and I was not quite sure how much of the film deviated from the original theatre performance. Had anyone seen the play before?
No, has it been revived that often? As far as I'm aware, this was the first revival that I'd been made aware of. Maybe that's just because it was showing locally-ish to me, more local perhaps than either of you.
I want to say it was revived 12 years ago, but I can't remember where I've read that. But that's still not exactly on constant tour, is it?
It was revived in Stratford in 2014, and it had a UK tour in 2010, and it was revived in London in 2002. That's
what, a 40-year gap between its initial production and its revival? Presumably because the film was so acclaimed, would be my guess.
It's funny because I walked out thinking that the film had deviated tremendously from the original play. And then I sat yesterday partly watching the film and partly sort of skipping through the film with the play, following it. And actually a tremendous amount of the play is in the film. They've shuffled around some of the bits sometimes. And even the projection with the figures on that appears on the stage. So at the top of the stage, there's the rolling death total and the battles. Well, that's all in the film as well, often hidden in the background or on a newsstand or on a billboard somewhere. It's quite subtle in the film. It's a bit more in your face in the play.
If I remember correctly, in the film, there's that amazing music hall scene, which is in a music, an end of pier music hall. And am I right in remembering, because I haven't watched the film since we discussed it last year some point, that they bring out the old music hall announcement, the cards that announce the next act, and those have the different battles and their casualty losses? Or am I making that up because it feels right to me?
But the music hall in the film is right at the start, so I'm not sure they've started coming up with the casualties.
I thought it came after Mons, or the initial wiping out of the BEF, but I could be wrong.
What I can tell you, though, is we took our family to my 11-year-old. I asked her this morning, what was your favourite part? And that recruitment section with I Want to Make a Man of You was my daughter's favourite part, or favourite song of the film anyway, of the play.
There you go. Vesta Tilley still having an impact 100 years on.
Which I really didn't expect. Of all the ones I thought she'd be humming. I actually said to her, what was your favourite part of going to see it? She went, the pizza beforehand.
It was a nice pizza.
My two, who are 12 and 15 respectively, were very confused by the ballroom scene, where they have actors using dresses to play two parts. So they act as the male lead holding dresses and then swap around. It was a very clever bit of staging, which I think caught both my kids' attention. They found it a bit confusing. There's a lot of politics there, and they didn't really get the politics. The bit they liked best, because they sing in a church choir, was the church scene, which is lovely, where they make the point that how many of the soldiers' songs used hymns as the musical basis with changed words. So I think my kids who knew all the hymns were appropriately amused by that.
Katie came out after she got confused with who Jerry was. Which one was Jerry? I'd failed to fully brief her on the way in.
Provide her with a glossary of terms.
Yeah, well, I've just said, I sent you the programme. It's interesting that the programme feels the need to have a double-page spread explaining the war, because there is that large section of the play, and it feels different as the play to the film, that's the explainer to it, and that slow walk into war that it portrays. Yet they have a double-page spread in the programme explaining the start of the war and how it all happened. They must have felt that cultural memory has slipped beyond us, and they have to explain it to the audience.
With a collection of like overlapping Venn diagrams to kind of illustrate the various alliances.
I mean, it is quite confusing, though, if you've ever tried to teach the origins of the First World War to a bunch of and this is even, I remember being taught this. Okay, so it was in the US, where perhaps it's not quite so much part of the memory, but I had an entire semester on just the origins of the First World War. This is not easy, graspable history in some ways. So I wonder how much that is that it slipped out of cultural memory, because 1963, the play does it, right? Needs to tell its audience for whom there would have been many people still living. That's almost an interesting question about how much awareness there was, even in 1914 to 1918, of the high politics, which is very much the focus of the play. It's interesting, being based on the soldiers' songs. It's not so much about the lived experience of the soldier in the trenches. There are a couple of scenes. That's not what the play's about. It's about the politics of it. Yeah,
there's a lot of, for want of a better term, of the kind of the grand political theatre aspect to it, with occasional zoom-ins on people who are being actual individuals rather than placeholders for nations.
Yeah. Lots of placeholders for nations.
Lots of placeholders for nations, which was great.
And a lot of French and Belgians.
Yes. And then at the beginning, some Russians who then disappear even before the Russian Revolution is supposed to happen.
Well, but there are Russians in the hunting scene.
Yes, there are.
Along with the Americans. It's the war as grand strategy, not the war as skirmishes.
But that's perhaps because it's a critique of class, which comes down to perhaps John Littlewood's communist background more than anything else.
Oh, absolutely. But also I think it's historiographically, that was the way in which the war was being written about, understood in the 1960s, right? This is the point about historiography, that the moment that the history is written reflects the issues of the time. This was the age of civil rights and revolutions.
Yeah, and the Cold War, and it might have been on A.J.P. Taylor's mind when he's sitting down in his office writing some of this stuff.
Or the fact that French students are throwing cobbles in the streets, or about to throw cobbles in the streets.
I gave the quote about John Littlewood saying it's nostalgic. There is something peculiarly nostalgic about it because of the lack of, I say uniforms, they do put them on as signifiers, helmets, and to demonstrate who you're talking about. But there is something nostalgic about those songs and the way those songs are performed, and nobody's getting killed. And it's very, very satirical. It's much more so than the film, I sort of thought, which is very much more political, because it very much is putting people in uniforms and being much more critical. So it does have that weird...
Are you suggesting that satire isn't political?
It's somewhere between. There is something genuinely nostalgic and music hall about it that perhaps isn't quite so much there in the film. It's there in the play.
Yeah, but I wonder to what extent is that, and I think this is the difficulty with a revival. When we watch the film, even if we watch it in the context of 2023, 2024, we are seeing what Attenborough captured in that moment when he made the film. Whereas when we watch a revival of the play, we're looking at Black-Eyed Theatre's interpretation of Joan Littlewood's interpretation of A Long, Long Trail, which in and of itself is an interpretation of soldiers' experience. It's the challenge of using cultural sources, as I always point out to my students, is that you get these layers of interpretation. So any revival is going to be nostalgic, if not for the war, then for 1963. And I did feel there was an element of that, of nostalgia for that sort of revolutionary class-based critique, if not for the war itself.
It's funny because it does make you wonder how much the cast sat and watched the film before they came to the theatre play, and how much of the film gets fed back in by accident, unwittingly.
I'd also wonder how much, whether or not, because I've got the bit in the program that we mentioned about, educating the audience on the origins of the First World War. I would love to know what the cast brought with them to the players, a background, understanding, and knowledge of the war.
Well, the unfortunate thing is we were slightly late getting to the theatre, and I then couldn't get the tickets up on my phone, and it was all a bit rushed getting in. But when I went to get the tickets printed out at the desk so that we could get them checked and we could get checked in, the artistic director was there. What I should have done was grabbed him and say, "We're podcasting about this. Can we interview you, please?" I didn't, because I was in such a rush and didn't quite work out. But yeah, it would have been good to actually speak to them.
That's the "Oh, what a lovely podcast" quality guarantee that our audience tune in for. We're never knowingly professional.
Entirely amateur, which is
100%.
Right in the spirit of this play, it must be said. That being said, the performers were extraordinary, because they all play their own instruments, multiple instruments. They all sing. They're
not just speaking the words of multiple languages. The pronunciation is on. Very, very skilled.
And there is only 6 of them. I think in the original cast, there's about 15 of them, which shows you how hard they're working to pull the whole thing off.
Yeah, so this was in the smaller of the 2 theatres at Leeds Playhouse. It is now Leeds Playhouse, isn't it? Not West Yorkshire Playhouse. They changed the name and I can never remember, which is the little black box theatre. And they threw balloons about. You have big signs saying, "Beware of if you have latex allergies, please speak to a member of staff."
I didn't see those signs.
Not big enough then. What would have been interesting is the level of audience participation. I mean, I knew, because this is material I work with, right? This is the sort of thing I know. First of all, I know all the tunes because I take my kids to church every Sunday and sit through 2 services. I know quite a lot of the words as well. But I do wonder if in 1963 you had sing-alongs by the audience.
I reckon so. Even if they're just subversive sing-alongs.
Well, that might depend on who the audience is. Is it playing to a young, rebellious audience, or do you get lots of old veterans turning up?
But I think they would know the songs, not because I think this is something Dan Todman wrote about in The Great War Myth and Memory. And of course, my copy is in the office and I'm not. I have a feeling that the audience, because the response to The Long, Long Trail, I seem to recall, was very, very much old soldiers coming out and reminiscing about, knowing the songs, but also to the extent that they would have taught them to their children, not necessarily their grandchildren, but they would have been part of the sort of culture. My mother taught me "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," and that was in the 80s. So,
well, my mother used to water in the house singing that. But I was going to say, there is a section of those songs that I actually know because we used to sing them as scouts on camp, and it stuck with us.
Exactly. So they're being taught by scout leaders. They're being taught by, my grandfather sang 1930s music hall songs to my mother, who then sang them to me. And we also had Daisy Daisy, but that goes back to turn of the century. That predates the war. So I suspect there would have been scope for a sing-along, which I don't think there is now.
It's implied in some of Todman's things that so he's got a sentence: "If old audience members had reservations about Oh, What a Lovely War's caricatures, they approved wholeheartedly of its songs." It does rather suggest that people are singing. He suggests that much of the audience is middle-aged and middle class. Everything, and the programme notes said, "Everything spoken during this evening either happened or was said, sung or written during 1914, 1918. I rather suspect people are singing.
Which you couldn't do in 2024.
No one knows the words.
No, unless you're weirdos like us.
It's moved into more of the high art realm, and we've moved further and further away from music hall, where people do actually sing along.
Well, but people sing along at concerts, right?
Maybe people sing along at musicals in London. I mean, I've been to musicals. I don't think people sing, but I think some have done.
There's been this critique recently, hasn't there, about the jukebox musicals and audience members who sing along to them and getting into fights with the staff. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's still the motivation, but even if the performers had encouraged it, and so where I started this thought process was talking about there was less audience participation than perhaps the size of the theatre might have suggested. It is on tour, so that it's not the production isn't designed for this specific theatre, but they did have a little bit in terms of telling us to turn our phones off and threatening to make us come up on stage and sing if our phones went off during the performance. But it was limited to that rather than sort of assuming that the audience would have enough knowledge of the material to be able to engage in audience participation.
One of the other interesting things about the original play, just looking at Dan Todman's thing, is that on its opening night, or just afterwards, the Observer apparently sought out AJP Taylor and Basil Littlehart, who were both in the audience. And sitting next to them during that performance would have either been very, very interesting or just dreadful, depending on circumstances.
I suspect pretty appalling, actually.
Yeah, I suspect it would have been pretty appalling as well. But it was, I think me and you were talking about it when we left the thing in regards to Haig, that both Taylor and Littlehart were saying that the play was too harsh on him, and AJP Taylor said that Haig wasn't as stupid as he's presented here, which is a pretty big thing for AJP Taylor to say, because he presents him as being pretty stupid in his work.
Well, I wasn't sure if Haig got a bigger blasting in the play than he does directly in the film. He is very critical of Haig, and he is mentioned by name all the way through, seemingly. And that scene you were alluding to is all very much about Haig, isn't it, Jessica?
But I remember that being true in the film. It's all about how Haig gets the top, becomes CIC. What I didn't remember from the film was the extent to which Haig's religious justifications were quoted directly, and also, bringing out the fact that it is his signature on the confirmation of courts-martial sentences which condemn men to death, so that he becomes the individual who is blamed for men who are shot. I didn't remember that very explicit message, which comes out in the play, in the film, but that could just be my poor memory. It might be there.
Well, that's what I was looking for in the film when I was trying to find it yesterday. I couldn't quite find quite as many references, or very overt references, as there is in the play.
Well, but the film has that family, so there isn't sort of that central voice from below set of characters, the family who go to war in the film. There's no equivalent of that in the play. So the only sort of named individuals are the generals. Otherwise, you get these various voices, but there's no continuity among them.
Yeah, it's easier to do in a play than it is in a film, where you're changing scene and changing kind of location far more early. I'm
slightly surprised that the original play had as many as 15 actors in. I thought it worked really effectively with just the 6. I mean, yes, they worked incredibly hard, but having them swap all the roles like that actually worked in some ways to there's that thing about Josephine Tay wrote about 1 million drowned in China is news, 1 child drowned in a pond is tragedy, and giving a sense of just the enormity of the numbers, not having sort of individuals you could focus on as being the ones you cared about, whether they survived or not.
Yeah, because they swap in and out so quickly.
Exactly. Just it made those numbers sort of more effective in some ways.
As 19 actors when it moves to the West End, there's even more of them. But there again, that might add a different dimension, because you can get more bodies on the stage.
I don't think you could have fit 19 people on that stage, to be honest.
But it did work very well with them all constantly changing roles. It's very clever. I did wonder. So Alan Clark's The Donkeys comes out in 61, doesn't it? So the play comes out in 63. So my assumption is that Clark's Donkeys is hugely influential on the play. I did wonder if by 69, and obviously this is before the 50th anniversary, I did wonder if by 69 the film's got a slightly different tone, because it's after the anniversary. We've had the Great War. There is sort of other things happening in the historiography, academic historiography. John Terrain's sort of trying to bring back Haig as not the beast that he might be portrayed in Donkeys. So it's 9 years later sort of thing. That is also a different play on the Haig character between the film and the play.
I suspect that is the case. And certainly something like The Great War, which had that, all the visual images of the old soldiers talking about their experience. You are seeing that shift. And I think this is Dan's point, isn't it? That shift starts at that point from discussion of generals and their choices to their relationship with politicians to being about, well, what was it actually like, Grandad?
You also get Day-Lewis's collected poems of Wilfred Owen published in 1963 as well, to start kind of making their way properly into the popular mindset.
And I'm just trying to remember, on the basis that Martin Middlebrook died last week, to give a sense of when we're recording this. So that's 1971, which is just a bit after that, which is, part of that tradition in the last quarter of the 20th century of really going out and digging into the Imperial War Museum archive and really finding these voices and using them to write the history. We're starting to get a history from below. Certainly the big set piece battles, and Lynn MacDonald's work on women and the like.
And there's certainly a nod in the programme to the change in historiography with the Alan Long, the artistic director of Wokingham, writing a piece entitled Lines Led by Donkeys, where he points to the fact that the historiography has changed, and there's sort of two views in it, although he nails his colours to the wall by pointing out his grandfather thought all the generals were bastards, and so that was probably more true than any of the more recent historiography suggesting otherwise.
Although it's interesting because he doesn't actually say that it was the opinion. He says that his strongest condemnation for the High Command calling them all bastard generals. That's the only direct quotation we have of the grandfather. But the Long writes that the opinion of Haig as a butcher was certainly one my grandfather William Webb would have shared. What's interesting about that is it really does fly in the face of the extent to which ex-soldiers hugely admired Haig as an individual. Generals as a category, yes, they get slated all the time. The staff, the generals, anyone above the rank of probably major is going to come in for a lot of abuse. But Haig, and it happens after the war to a large extent, but his support for the ex-servicemen is hugely valued. His political lobbying for them, whatever he does during the war, is redeemed. And I think the problem with the historiography of this period is that it stops in 1918. Its evaluation of Haig is what happens between 1914 and 18. What does he do? What are his actions? And actually, ex-servicemen's opinions of Haig are as much based on what he does in 1919, 1920, 1921, etc., as they are in the previous 4 years.
What's interesting also about the programme, with this bit of Lines Led by Donkeys, is the image choices that they have. So, they've got Haig in full kind of military dress uniform regalia with, buttons and badges and stuff like that. Then immediately set against a bunch of soldiers stuck in a fairly unpleasant trench. And then you've got French Jock and Haig with Henry Wilson kind of visiting the front line, and then kind of soldiers behind the lines. But it's always like that behind, safe behind the lines versus reality in the trench kind of thing. And it ends with a bunch of crosses in a military cemetery, which are French. Rather than actually being CWGC. So they're not even British casualties.
But that photograph apes that last photo from the end of the film with all the crosses, the thousands of crosses.
But that works. I mean, that works with the play itself, right? Because it's the music is British, except there's the one scene where they have a French song with that wonderful Frenchman. He has his mustache drawn on his drumstick. There's that whole bizarre section on the Irish contribution, which manages to very neatly skate over the Easter Uprising in an impressive manner.
But kind of vaguely suggests that there may have been just cause for it. Because those Irish they get shelled by their own guns, don't they?
For all that it's a very fractured narrative, it's just a bizarre interpolation. But there is quite a lot of the fact that it's not just the British fighting. There's a lot of other people involved.
Which is also something of a break from the 1960s historiography, which is spectacularly British in all of its major focuses.
One scene that was missing from the film is that whole scene where the general turns up and he refuses to, because he refused to speak French, doesn't need to speak French to the Frenchman.
It's Sir John French who had trouble interacting with the French because he didn't speak French.
The driving there is in the film, but because it's quite a long scene in the play as well, with them not communicating through the language barrier that he doesn't feel he needs to worry about.
Yeah. Well, in that sense, the play is very, or certainly the interpretation that we saw the other night, was very, very front-loaded at the early years of the war. And a part of that is probably, for framing, he kind of introduced a wider kind of concept. But they spent a lot of time on 1914 and up to mid 1915.
And then they sort of race through the Somme, Passchendaele, Verdun. And part of that, they keep putting the numbers up, but the speed with which they go through them, it makes you realize to some extent why for so long the Somme was understood as the first day rather than 6 months of battle.
Well, it's Bill Phillpot's 1st of July syndrome that he writes about in Bloody Victory, I think. I mean, even Passchendaele whizzes by for something that, there have been arguments that for a lot of ex-servicemen, Passchendaele and Third Ypres is the one for them rather than the Somme so much. And we get nothing really for 1918 and the end of the war.
There's a little bit on the Spring Offensive.
That's sort of the end. That's it, isn't it? The Spring Offensive, and that's sort of done. I'm trying to think where the interval sits, actually. How far through the war do you get before the interval?
Like mid-1915.
Not that far. We only get to 1915.
Which left me wondering how? How are we going to fit quite a lot of stuff in?
And the film is long. Because the play was, just over 2 hours with a 15-minute interval. So it's 2 hours of acting. And as we said, the actors are doing a huge amount. You couldn't really ask them to do much more.
Yeah, so Act 2 starts April 1915, which shows you how front-loaded it all is. Actually, they do spend a tremendous amount of time just getting to the war, which to be fair, the film does as well, but I'd sort of thought it would pace it up a bit for the play. It's
interesting how much it is still embedded in those politics. It is a play about the politics and the origins of the war, not about the culture, the social history of the war, the culture, the experience, which is so much what, at least from my perspective, what I think of the history of the war, what the historiography focuses on now. If you look at the big books that are coming out, other than the rehash of the origins, Patrick, Christopher Clark.
The other interesting thing about the battles, when they put the numbers up, I mean, again, this is something that Dan Todman flagged up, that it gives the audience the impression that they're all basically British casualties, where all the things get rolled together. But they also do the thing that, we've all kind of encountered this in various ways, of rolling casualty and death, or kind of injured and death together. So you get the Somme, 60,000 casualties, or as well, yes and no.
And they do odd things about where they disaggregate British casualties from casualties overall, which manages to make Verdun a battle that the British are involved with in a really weird way.
I'm not sure the French are going to be on board with that particular interpretation. They're very protective of it.
Did they cover any of the other theatres? Does Gallipoli get a mention? I'm just trying to remember. We definitely get very brief Australian troops and a version of Waltzing Matilda. Do we get Canadians? I don't think we get the Canadians. And don't get any Indians. We certainly don't get any Chinese Labour Corps.
Is there a mention of Japan at one point? I can't remember.
Yes. One of the diplomatic scenes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
The first one, because they're talking about the Russo-Japanese War as a precursor.
Yeah, it's not a very imperial war.
No. Well, it talks about empire, but
yeah, as a concept that exists, you never actually get shown it
to be critiqued. Yeah. A very 1960s take on why empire is bad.
I wonder if the Canadians don't get a mention because they haven't got a song that's as popular as Waltzing Matilda to crank out. You do wonder what gets added in just because there's a song.
But what's interesting, of course, is it's a Canadian who writes the best known poem of the war, because McCrae is Canadian. I am a Canadian Medical Corps officer.
Did we enjoy it?
Yeah, it was fun. So, like, did I walk out of there learning anything I didn't already know? No.
But did you need to? I mean, does it need to do that?
That's the thing. I don't think I needed to, which makes it interesting because, we've spoken before and even in this podcast about the fact that, the three of us have largely wasted large portions of our life on this particular topic. But there is an element of the play is also framed as a slightly educational thing. There is an undercurrent of that.
But I think that was quite interesting. So I don't know if Katie felt this, but certainly my son, who's 15 and who's not doing history for GCSE.
I said neither did I, so who am I to talk?
His school put him in an impossible position, but he would have dropped German to do history. I'm not quite sure how I feel about this. But we had quite a long conversation afterwards about historical interpretation and about the way in which Haig was presented and why that isn't a historical truth, that it is an interpretation of a particular historical moment. And being me, I talked about the difference between the interpretation of Haig in the 1920s, the interpretation of Haig in the 1960s, and the interpretation of Haig today. It certainly prompted the questions in a intelligent 15-year-old who is dealing, has been exposed to the idea of interrogating your sources in history. So I think it does. I don't know if it's necessarily the educational lessons that either this lot of artistic producers or Jen Littlewood necessarily anticipated, but it does have that function, as well as being, my kids enjoyed it.
I think what's interesting is a quote at the back of the play by Victor Spinetti, who's in the original, and he said his original problem with the Long Long Trail is they had the BBC singers do it, and it didn't feel right them banging out the songs, where he felt that them on stage doing the songs was performed in a much more raucous manner, which made them more engaging for the audience, which helped carry the whole thing across. And I think that's true. The anarchic way that it comes out of as them, they're not perfect. It's a small mixed cast, really cracking them out with gusto, really helps carry it very, very well.
And one question I did have in relation to what the 1963 production would have been like was the level of sexual innuendo, which is very authentic to what music hall would have been like circa 1918. I wonder how much that was in there circa 1963. But it was definitely there for this one, which was great fun.
It was very good. Even down the Christmas truce, no footballs.
Which is very pleasing.
I was expecting a football any moment now. I thought, here it comes.
No, but cigarettes and chocolate.
As we learned with one of our many Christmas with Mark Connolly's.
And booze. At some point we do need to do something on intoxicants in the First World War for this podcast.
So have we got anything else to add? Other than I think it's worthwhile. So if people have never seen What a Lovely War at the Theatre, it's very much worth seeing. It's excellent. It's
a good night at the theatre. Lots of fun music. It's very accessible music. That's the joy of hymns, right?
And I noticed now, I don't think it had been previously, but it now seems to be added to the Spotify playlist. The original cast doing the music is on Spotify rather than just from the film, which I don't think was there a year ago. Or if it was, Alexa wasn't playing it for me. But she suddenly is. Well,
is it still on tour? Should we be recommending people to keep an eye out? Because if it is coming to a venue near you, I would recommend it.
Well, if you are keen on seeing it, people are going to have to pull their fingers out because the last show will be May 17th at Didcot. It's going to be at Hoddesdon, Worthing, Basildon before that, Wolverhampton. You'll have to be quick. That's the 2nd of May. It is still just about touring if you are listening to this the day it releases on the 1st of May.
Which is today, because we record this live for the first time.
Having dropped my clangor about Martin Middlebrook's death.
But perhaps if people look out for perhaps an Amdram version of it or something, but I'm sure they come round from time to time. It's absolutely worth watching. It's superb. It is superb. the staging was faultless, and the actors. It's just remarkable how they could all somehow play every instrument, and you're trying to think, well, he plays. Oh no, he's playing the trombone now, and she's. Oh no, they're all on the piano. It's just remarkable, a talented set of people.
Very, 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 very well staged and acted. So yeah, it was good fun. I'm glad we did this.
I don't think we have any idea where we are for June's episode, do we,
Nope.
Chris?
Nope, no idea. It'll be something.
Yeah, we should.
That'd be exciting then.
Yeah, I'm sure we can come up with something. Intoxicants, perhaps.
Yeah, or unless we can think of a fun special guest.
I can say at that point in the examination cycle, I will almost certainly need all the intoxicants I can get.
Oh, fantastic. We'll go to, in true First Reward style, we'll go to Harrods and get everything you could possibly want in a hamper.
Indeed.
Very good. Well, so until next time, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we must be eggs and ham when we got plum